On today's show, plenty of rumors to sift through on a bonus episode of the podcast, including and headlined by the notion of a Gallinari for Dejounte Murray swap that would be very interesting for the Hawks. We'll get into all of the details on that and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1270, a bonus episode of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening into Tuesday. Thank you for joining us, as always, on the podcast. Make it your first listen each and every day. Check out the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and, of course, on the video side over at YouTube. And, a lot to get to. Not a full episode necessarily, as we're deep into the night here. I actually have a pre-banked episode that I'm going to be sharing later this week about AJ Griffin, sort of a deep dive that I'm looking forward to sharing with you about 45 minutes or so on Griffin as a prospect and sort of his background, the way that he plays, et cetera. That's all coming. But there's lots of rumor stuff out there with the Hawks right now. Of course, we're getting closer to the deadlines respective as they are. Number one with Gallinari coming on Wednesday. Free agency opens in the NBA, by the way, on Thursday evening, June 30th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So we are less than 70 hours from free agency as I record this deep into the night on Monday. So a lot of little things to get to. And there was some reporting that came out on Monday that prompted some questions that I'm going to answer on the podcast today. So I figured I had some time to knock out a quick episode, not full length, but anything that's extra bonus content this time of year, I'm sure is appreciated. And here we go with all of that. So since our last podcast, by the way, I recorded on Sunday night. That is still relevant at this point. Nothing that at least as of this moment, nothing I said on Sunday night is out of date at this point in time. So keep that in mind. Subscribe to the podcast, listen to that show as it was. But the first thing, sort of in chronological order, that happened on Monday was Mark Stein reporting on Monday afternoon that, quote, the ultimate destination remains unknown, but the sources briefed on the process continued to say that Atlanta's John Collins is highly likely to be traded this offseason, end quote. So, as I said on the Sunday show, I've heard the same. Not that it's done by any means. I keep stressing, and this is on purpose, that nothing is assured with John Collins. I think people, that are smarter than I am and that have more sources than I am are saying still they believe they will probably be traded, but I will never go to the definitely point. I know a lot of Hawks fans are sort of been assuming this is going to be happening at some point in the near future. It still could happen. It still could be likely, but certainly a little bit of a flattening on some level dating back to Wednesday. I probably have less confidence now than I did Wednesday, that's for sure, when it comes to John being moved. And I say that in part because of a report that came from Zach Klein of WSB TV locally here in Atlanta on Monday afternoon. He reported that while many believe the Hawks are looking at Dejounte Murray, which has been reported by multiple outlets, including Jake Fisher and Mark Stein, et cetera, Klein says it's, quote, looking like John Collins is not part of the deal, end quote, for Dejounte Murray. He then mentions a construction in that tweet about Gallinari and multiple picks going to San Antonio. I had heard something kind of similar to that. I checked on it after actually seeing the report from Zach. And I think it was one of the discussions that happened between the Hawks and the Spurs. I'm not sure if that's the only one that's still ongoing, but that was definitely sort of out there as that transpired. And then also later on in the evening, Jake Fisher sort of confirmed that that reporting about that being a discussion point between the Hawks and the Spurs. I said there is, quote, plenty of conversation, and also noted that there have been talks about increasing the partial guarantee on Gallinari's contract. As a reminder, Gallinari becomes fully guaranteed for more than $20 million for next season on June 29th. That's actually a 5 p.m. Eastern time deadline for the Hawks to make a decision on Gallo. I've said this before, but no one believes that he'll be guaranteed and playing in Atlanta on that $21+ million contract for next season. But there are some weird salary cap machinations in the mix here with regard to Gallo if they were to use him as the primary salary for a player like Dejounte Murray or anybody else such as Dejounte Murray. For the Hawks to trade Gallo for Murray without doing anything else, there are some salary cap things that have to happen. First, they have to guarantee enough of Gallo's salary to match Murray's incoming number for cap reasons and just salary matching reasons under the NBA trade rules. Basically, they could guarantee up to $10.5 or so million on Gallo's deal, and that would work in a one-for-one swap with Murray. Of course, the Hawks have to attach picks to Gallinari. No one believes it's going to be Gallinari for Murray without a lot of pick compensation. But if there's no players alongside Gallinari, if it's just Gallo for Murray plus picks, they would have to be guaranteeing like $10.5 million for Gallo rather than the $5 million that he is currently guaranteed for next season. And by the way, this is all talking about a deal being done before Wednesday at 5. So a very sort of narrow timeline here, less than 2 days as I record this. Or you can do the deal later on, but then Gallo has to be fully guaranteed if he's going to be on the Hawks roster unless something changes. And the third way you could do that, of course, would be for Gallo to work with the Hawks to push that guarantee date back. But he would have to have an incentive to do that. Gallinari and his agent are not going to do that out of the kindness of their heart. They have to be sort of rewarded in some way, whether that means guaranteeing more of that contract, et cetera. That's usually the way that works. If for a guy that has their guarantee date pushed back, you want to get something in return for that if you're Gallo or his agent. So the Hawks may be offered to push that back on a week or so and give him more guaranteed money in the meantime. So those are some options that they could possibly do. But again, if it's only a Gallinari for Murray swap, they have to guarantee more on Gallo's contract or the deal cannot work in that exact form. The other option, which I've discussed at least in passing before, is that the Hawks could still get off of Gallo's money in a separate transaction before Wednesday. And the most obvious way to do that without taking any money back, that's the crucial part, without taking any money back, if you are the Hawks, you might not want to do that, would be to engage with Oklahoma City. They are the only team right now that has enough cap space for the current league year. And by the way, just as a reminder, the league year changes over on July 1st. So we're 3 or 4 days away from that as I record this. But in the next day and a half, the Hawks could trade Gallo to Oklahoma City, who could take his deal back in full and then actually only, they sort of move on from him at that point in time, then cut him, only counting for that smaller salary, whereas the Hawks could just kind of get off that with maybe an asset going to Oklahoma City, like a second-round pick, something like that, in order to have the Thunder do that favor for the Hawks to save them that $5 million on the cap and really more importantly, the luxury tax. So lots more to get into on this, but I will just say one more time before we take a quick break and then we'll come back with the rest of this podcast. The tax is not a line that the Hawks cannot cross, but there are lots of people who believe the Hawks do not want to cross it. I'm certainly just a messenger on that one, but I've been saying that for a while. I don't believe the Hawks are going to pay the tax until they do. They certainly could. I'm not saying they definitely can't, but that might be sort of an artificial cap on their spending in the near future, which might make things more interesting. Of course, you have Trae Young earning all NBA and making $6 million extra that the Hawks maybe weren't planning for all the way across. Makes their life difficult. And by the way, if they were to trade for Murray with only Gallo going out, they are over the tax at that point in time with only 10 players on the roster. So that's a lot of machinations going to be happening potentially if they were to pull that off. Obviously, it's a good problem to have when you have Murray on your roster. If you just swap him for Gallo, you're a lot better than you were before that. But much more stuff to get into in a moment. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by Rock Auto. And the auto world has been mixing models these days. It's actually impossible for local chain stores to stock all the car and truck parts that you actually need for your automobile. But even if they had them, you actually want to endure all the people behind the counter. They want to sell you what they want to sell you. It's in their best interest to have a commission or whatever's in their warehouse, etc. Instead, do what's best for you, the actual consumer. And the best thing to do if you're the consumer is check out rockauto.com at home or in your pocket. It's a much better option overall. Why spend more for the exact same auto parts from a chain store or dealership when you order them online at rockauto.com? It's a family business. They've served customers for more than 20 years at this point, and Rock Auto's prices are reliably low for each and every customer. And they have absolutely everything you could possibly want for your car or your truck. That includes brake parts and motor oil, tail lamps, even carpet. Check out the website right now at rockauto.com. Today, see all the parts available for your car or your truck. And when you get there, write Locked On in the box that asks you how you heard about rockauto.com so you can tell them that we sent you their way. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. The NBA draft is, of course, over at this point, but the madness continues in a big way with free agency on the horizon. Summer League is coming up in July, and 2023 projections are already flying around in the futures market across the basketball world. And with that in mind, BetOnline is a place to fire away on all the stuff in the futures side of things. Plus, BetOnline is the number one source for all of your betting needs and information, both in the near future and always. Find all the latest odds, news, and developments across the sports world, including major events, MLB odds and scores, latest fights, and even next season's futures on the NBA, NFL, college football, and college basketball. And even then, it's a continuous source for all the wagering avenues like live betting, esports, poker, and a ton of casino games, and much more. And they have other sports in the mix as well. That includes tennis and golf and hockey, which just concluded, but always has future stuff as well. Auto racing, rugby, lacrosse, table tennis, horse racing, soccer, cricket, and entertainment bets, as well as any sport you can possibly think of. BetOnline very likely has it. And head there right now to BetOnline on your mobile device to learn more about all the trends and the action in the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, and more on this Gallo / Murray / rumblings, all of this stuff that is out there. I will say, just big picture speaking, at least from what I'm hearing right now, and just kind of putting together all the intel that I have, it's just one scenario. But I've actually heard the Hawks have turned down a couple of things with that Gallo Murray construction. There's some interesting reporting here, and this is sort of a media nerd kind of thing, but the Spurs kind of famously don't leak, and right now there's a lot coming out on the negotiation, whether it be agent talk or maybe the Hawks are leaking or something like that. But it's a little bit weird that there's been a lot of sort of step-by-step kind of reporting about this situation. Interesting stuff there. That doesn't really change anything, but kind of also a question about why the Spurs would be doing this. Because if you call behind the scenes, there's a camp that's like, why are the Spurs even doing this? Because Murray's really good, and maybe they don't want to trade him. They're just taking offers. That's possible as well. The Spurs, though, are always buttoned up, so I kind of just don't know. At least I don't have a great feel on the Spurs at this point in time. But moving him for a pick package is that basically we'll be doing. If Collins is not in the deal, as been reported potentially, that would be a pretty bold move by the Spurs to trade their best current player for Gallo, who doesn't help them really for the future, and picks. That would be a full-on like tear-down move by the Spurs, that's a franchise that has not done that really at all. Even when they probably should have done that, like in the Kawhi trade, they opted for the more short-term, addition of DeMar DeRozan, et cetera, in that kind of trade. So maybe it's time for them to do that, but it would be definitely a sharp departure for the Spurs, which definitely asks people. I would say people are asking questions as to why that might happen, or if it might happen through the reporting that's been out there so far. But I kind of shrug at this point in time, and we'll see on all of that stuff. Also, a lot of people were asking me sort of a mailbag style, what kind of assets would have to be included for the Hawks to get Murray back in a swap for Gallo as the principal in order to keep John Collins along the same front. I will say it's probably going to need to be 3 assets to do that. Maybe if the sweetener was someone like a Kongwu, it might be less than that, but I would not want to trade a Kongwu if I could help it. But everybody else that is on the Hawks roster, whether it be if it's just picks, I would guess it would take 3. It's been reporting about the Drew Holiday package that the Spurs are looking for, and I tweeted this today, but I have heard repeatedly the Spurs are asking for the moon for Murray, which they should if he's available. But it's just kind of a weird negotiation point there. Regardless, though, I would say if you made me project a deal that is definitely around this structure of Gallo for Murray, I would say Gallo plus 3 picks, whether it be their own picks or the Charlotte pick or some combination of the two. I wouldn't go super completely unencumbered picks. I want to guarantee. I want to sort of guarantee them at some protect them at some point. But alas, that's kind of the risk that you're doing there if you're going to trade for someone like Murray. But I would say 3 assets probably. Also, as I mentioned briefly before the break, if you trade for Murray, you are already into the tax with 10 guys on your roster. Now, the Hawks have ways to get out of the tax. They could get off of Kevin Huerter, for instance, because if you trade for Dejounte Murray using Gallo, you don't necessarily have to trade either Huerter or Bogdanovich, but you do have sort of an overflow. You have basically 4 starting caliber guys in your backcourt. Obviously, trade's not going anywhere, but you might want to go ahead and maybe triage a little bit by moving off of one of your 8-figure per year shooting guards with regard to Huerter or Bogdanovich if you're bringing in Murray to start at the 2 next to Trae Young. That's one option. Obviously, Collins can still be moved. That's an option that's also out there if you want to get a little bit cheaper on that front. But I will say, just as an advocate for the fans, there's no argument that they actually have to do that. For money purposes, I was telling somebody today on Twitter that kind of didn't believe me, but the Hawks could just do a lot of different stuff to pay money and not have to worry about this if they want to pay the luxury tax. And they can go get Murray with Gallo and picks and just run them back the rest of the roster. They could even re-sign DeLon Wright if they wanted to. They'd be expensive, but they would be better than they were last year. And that's the best possible case scenario for making their roster better if you don't care about money. And Hawks fans, probably shouldn't care about money, but alas, Rustler probably does on some level. Also, the Spurs don't have to keep Gallo given their cap structure, which is kind of maybe one of the reasons why they might do that is to clear some more space for San Antonio to make sort of maybe a big push for a young player or whatever. Again, there's all kinds of stuff out there about, maybe Huerter being pursued by the Celtics. It was kind of a rumor that was rumbling online a little bit and even behind the scenes because they have a trade exception. But that would be a move that only makes sense if the Hawks were to have Murray on their roster. The Hawks, at least in my mind, should not be trying to dump Kevin Huerter for nothing in return unless they have Murray on their roster. So lots of moving parts, and I've rambled a little bit more on that than I probably planned to on this podcast. But my overall standing is the same. If you're a new listener or maybe you're checking on this podcast for the first time, I am pro the pursuit of Dejounte Murray. I think it's not the absolute A+++ fit necessarily because he's not really a shooter at this point in time. And I think you're probably buying a little bit high on him in the market. But make no mistake, there are a lot of things to like about a Dejounte Murray pursuit. His defense, in particular, having a number 2 shot creator for the first time on the perimeter like that would be awesome. He's a pretty young player still, really talented guy, good rebounder as well, which definitely helps, good passer. So checks a lot of boxes for the Hawks. Can guard opposing point guards and also play a little bit off the ball with Trey. You can get Trey off the ball a little bit as well with Murray as a guy who he potentially respects enough to actually move off the ball a little bit more. So a lot to like about that potential partnership. And we'll see. Of course, we'll cover that more if it actually gets more hot and heavy in the next couple of days. Last thing before we get out of here, this is a very small thing compared to the Murray pursuit, but there was one piece of reporting on Sunday. I talked about all the guys who have been reported to be joining the Hawks in Summer League. One more guy on Monday that was reported was Chandler Hutchinson, a former first-round pick in 2018, who I actually liked a lot in that draft. I was kind of wrong on that draft, honestly. He's only played about 100 games in the NBA, 103 in particular, actually, to be specific, but just didn't make shots. That was the problem there. He was a wing that had to make shots and just didn't make shots. But an interesting sort of flyer prospect for the Hawks at age 26 in Summer League. Probably not a guy that matters too much, but a familiar name to some people. It could be an interesting guy for the Hawks to bring to Las Vegas. Also, I posted the bonus video/audio of the AJ Griffin, Tyrese Martin introductory press conference on Monday. No real analysis from that. Just wanted to give people the opportunity to sort of hear from them directly. And of course, we'll cover them more at Summer League. And again, I recorded a pretty deep podcast about AJ Griffin. It'll be running later this week, potentially on this podcast feed. But obviously, there's so much news that podcast will pretty much hold. So I'm going to try to hold it as long as I possibly can because nothing's going to change with Griffin unless it's traded. But I said that probably could happen. Along the way, though, full coverage. We'll have that coming up. We'll have a free agency preview of sorts. And honestly, that's pretty tough to do right now because we don't really know what the Hawks are in the market for. If the Hawks were to do the Murray deal with Gallo, they don't have a whole lot of flexibility beyond that. But if they were to trade John Collins, they have to kind of go out and find a starting caliber 4 on the free agent market, whether with a mid-level or a trade or whatever. So some moving parts there. I will say, as a point of caution, the Hawks don't really have like massive cap space. They have no cap space, but no massive flexibility to go out and add like big names. People are already asking me for like guys who are way too good for the Hawks to go out and sign. I will say, just as a general rule, which is not a bad thing. It's just being practical is important here. I'll try to lay that stuff out from the cap perspective later on this week. And once we have clarity on Gallo, that will help a little bit in terms of laying out what the Hawks can and can't do on the free agent market, because again, that is Thursday night. We're coming up very, very fast on that. And then next week is all about Summer League and free agency and all that fun stuff. And the fun never stops in this space. So please subscribe to the podcast. Thank you for listening to this bonus shorter episode of the show. And we'll have much more coming later on this week. Follow me on Twitter if you'd like to at BT Rowland. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. And we'll see you next time.